The evening air hung heavy with the faint hum of traffic as Kesha Robinson steered her car down the familiar streets toward home. Exhaustion weighed on her shoulders, the kind that seeps into your bones after a day spent wrestling with secrets too big for most minds to grasp. Her thoughts churned with the classified briefings she'd pored over at the Pentagon, details of covert operations, encrypted codes, and fragile alliances that could tip the world into chaos if mishandled. She was a woman who carried the nation's trust in her steady hands, a black woman who'd fought tooth and nail to rise through ranks, where every step forward felt like defiance against an unspoken rule. People like her weren't supposed to be here. Yet here she was, a guardian of truths so sensitive they could rewrite the balance of power overnight. Her reverie snapped as red and blue lights pulsed in her rearview mirror, slicing through the dusk like a blade. A flicker of irritation crossed her mind. She missed a signal. She glanced at the speedometer, steady, lawful. Her tires hugged the road with precision, her license pristine, her life meticulously ordered. There was no reason for this. Still, she pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath her wheels, and rolled down her window. The officer approached, his silhouette sharp against the fading light, his face carved with a sternness that felt premeditated. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and unyielding, already brimming with a judgment she knew too well. "License and registration," he barked, his voice a steel trap, daring her to flinch. Kesha's pulse quickened, but her hands moved with practiced calm. Retrieving the documents from the glove box, she handed them over, her fingers brushing the leather wallet that held her Pentagon ID she wouldn't flash. Unless she had to, everything was in order, as always. No tickets, no warrants, no blemishes. She watched him scan the papers, his jaw tight, his gaze lingering not on the details but on her face, searching for something to pin his suspicions on. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusation. "Mum, step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone sharper now, edged with impatience. Confusion rippled through her. "Why? What's the reason?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a quiet challenge. His hand drifted toward his holster, a subtle threat that sent a chill down her spine. "I said step out," he repeated, each word a hammer striking stone. Kesha exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She knew the stakes, knew how quickly this could spiral, how her skin made her a target no matter her title. Her hands rose where he could see them, deliberate and slow. Before she opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt, the cool night air brushed her skin, but it did little to ease the heat rising in her chest. "Turn around, hands behind your back," he ordered, and disbelief crashed over her like a wave. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with the raw, bitter edge of incredulity. His lips curled into a smirk, a glint of satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "You don't tell me what's wrong or right. You do as you're told." The cuffs clicked around her wrists, cold steel biting into her skin. And in that moment, a familiar anger bloomed deep, silent, suffocating. It wasn't the loud, fiery kind that demands release. It was the slow burn of knowing the game was rigged. The kind black people carry like a second shadow. The kind that whispers, "No amount of dignity or achievement can shield you from this." "Tell me what I did," she pressed, her words sharp now, cutting through the haze of his authority. "This is illegal," he chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "Obstruction of justice. Disobeying an officer. You refuse to show respect." Respect. The word landed like a slap. Kesha swallowed the rage clawing up her throat. The rage of a woman who'd earned respect through decades of sacrifice, briefing presidents, outsmarting enemies, safeguarding a nation, only to have it stripped away by a man drunk on his own power. The ride to the station was a blur of silence, his smugness radiating from the driver's seat like heat off pavement. To him, this was a victory, another tally mark in a ledger of control. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Kesha stood, wrists still bound, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the indignity of her situation. Eyes darted toward her, some curious, some smug, others uneasy, but no one spoke up. The officer, Blake, stood tall beside her, chest puffed with pride, ready to spin his tale. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with rehearsed conviction. She was openly disrespectful and refused to follow direct orders. "That's grounds for obstruction of justice," The judge, a weary man with a lined face, leaned forward, his brow creasing. Disrespect. What exactly did she do? Blake straightened, unfazed. She refused to address me with the proper respect an officer of the law is due. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with skepticism. The judge's gaze narrowed, his fingers tapping the bench as if weighing the absurdity of the claim. Blake stood firm, awaiting the nod of approval, the affirmation that his badge made him untouchable. Then the doors swung open. A court officer burst in, his steps quick and purposeful, his face taut with urgency. He approached the bench, slipping a note into the judge's hand and whispering something low and rapid. The judge's eyes flicked to the paper, then to Kesha, and in that instant, the air shifted. His spine straightened, his expression hardening with a gravity that hadn't been there before. "Officer Blake, step forward," the judge said, his voice a quiet thunder. Blake blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Excuse me," he stammered, his smirk wavering. "Step forward now," the judge snapped. The officer complied, but his confidence was fraying, unraveling thread by thread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he could feel it slithering up his spine. The judge set the note down, his gaze locking onto Kesha, the woman he'd moments ago seen as just another defendant. "Miss Robinson," he said, his tone softening, "you are free to go, effective immediately." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Blake whirled, his face twisting with fury. "Wait, what? You can't!" Just before he could finish, another officer strode in, his boots echoing against the tile. "Officer Blake," he said, voice flat and final, "you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending further investigation." Time seemed to freeze. The color drained from Blake's face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. His world built on the shaky foundation of unchecked power crumbled beneath him, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, a man undone by his own arrogance. Kesha's cuffs fell away with a soft clink, and she rolled her wrists, shaking off the weight of his malice. She turned to face him, her eyes steady, unyielding, not with triumph, but with the quiet strength of someone who'd weathered storms he couldn't fathom. She didn't need to speak. Her presence said it all. Justice, slow and relentless, had found its mark. The Pentagon's call had ripped through his petty tyranny like a tidal wave, revealing the fragility of his authority and the depth of her resilience. Across the room, the court officer who'd delivered the note watched in silence, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a young man, barely 30, with a nervous energy that belied his crisp uniform. He'd overheard whispers of Blake's reputation, stories of intimidation, of stops with no cause, of a man who wielded his badge like a club. Delivering that note had felt like a small rebellion, a crack in the wall of complicity he'd been trained to uphold. Beside him, an older woman in the gallery clutched her purse, her eyes glistening. She'd seen too many scenes like this, too many moments where power crushed the innocent, and for once she felt the stirrings of hope. Blake's partner, a rookie named Daniels who'd lingered by the door, shifted uneasily. He'd ridden with Blake for months, swallowing his discomfort at the older man's tactics, telling himself it was just how things were done. Now, watching Blake's downfall, guilt gnawed at him, guilt for the times he'd stayed silent, for the people he'd let Blake harass. The lesson sank deep. Power without accountability was a house of cards, and consequences, when they came, spared no one. Kesha stepped out into the courthouse hallway, the morning light spilling through the windows in golden streaks. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The weight of the cuffs was gone, but the weight of the world, the one she'd sworn to protect, remained. And in that moment, she knew no badge, no bias, no abuse of authority could erase her worth. Justice might crawl, might falter, but it always found its way. A slow fire burning through the darkness until the truth stood clear. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Kesha Robinson's office, casting long, thin shadows across the polished hardwood floor. She sat at her desk, her posture impeccable, her hands steady as they flipped through the pages of a confidential report. Her work was her voice, her shield, her sword, each success a brick in the fortress she'd built against a world that had never intended to make space for her. She didn't need to shout or boast. The results she delivered were louder than any doubter's scorn. sharper than any skeptic's blade. Her phone vibrated harshly against the desk, a jarring interruption to her focus. She glanced at it, her dark eyes narrowing slightly as she read the message from her assistant. Briefing moved to 9 a.m. General Peterson wants you in early. Kesha let out a slow, deliberate exhale, her fingers brushing through her sleek, straightened hair, a ritual to steady herself for the marathon ahead. Another day loomed, heavy with decisions that would ripple through corridors of power most Americans would never glimpse. She closed the folder with a soft thud, slid it into her secure briefcase, and rose to her feet, smoothing the lines of her tailored blazer. Every movement was calculated, a testament to the discipline she'd forged over years of navigating a world that offered her no margin for error. Beyond her office walls, Washington, D.C., pulsed with its relentless energy. The streets thrummed with the blare of horns, the hurried steps of pedestrians, and the clipped strides of government officials in their dark suits, each one a cog in the city's vast machine. Kesha stepped outside, the crisp air biting at her skin as she approached her black SUV. Her driver, a stoic man with graying temples and a perpetually furrowed brow, gave her a curt nod through the rearview mirror. She didn't enjoy being chauffeured. Control was her preference. Her comfort, but her position demanded it. The risks were too real, the threats too constant. As the vehicle merged into the snarl of traffic, her mind wandered, drifting to the echoes of her past. She thought of her mother, a woman whose hands were roughened by years of juggling two jobs, her back bent under the weight of sacrifice to send Kesha to school. She thought of her father, his voice stern yet tender as he'd told her, "No one's coming to save you, baby girl. You've got to claw your way up, every inch, every day." He'd been right. From her first day in law enforcement, she'd felt the suffocating press of doubt, too young, too driven, too black. Yet she'd climbed, outworking, outsmarting, outlasting every obstacle, every sneer. Still, some refused to see her. To them, her achievements were invisible, her worth reduced to the biases they clung to like lifelines. Officer Daniel Blake was one of those people. At 42, with over 15 years on the force, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never had to prove anything. The badge on his chest was a golden ticket to authority handed to him the moment he pinned it on. Respect assumed rather than earned. He'd grown up in a world that bent to accommodate him, where his stumbles were shrugged off as honest mistakes, while others paid dearly for less. The streets of D.C. were his kingdom, and he knew every lever of power his uniform granted him. Blake thrived on that control, relished the way it let him shape the narrative of every encounter. But the world was shifting beneath his feet, and he hated it. The cameras, the scrutiny, the questions they gnawed at him, eroding the unquestioned dominance he'd once enjoyed. And then there were people like Kesha Robinson, people who strode into spaces they weren't supposed to occupy, who held their heads high as if they belonged. To Blake, they were intruders, threats to the order he'd sworn to uphold. So when he spotted her black SUV gliding through the night, its sleek lines cutting through the shadows, he saw an opportunity. It wasn't about justice or safety, it was about putting her in her place, reminding her that no matter how high she rose, she'd never be above him. The stop unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Blake flipped on his lights, the red and blue slicing through the darkness as he pulled her over on a quiet stretch of road. Kesha's heart thudded, not with fear, but with a weary recognition. She knew the script. She'd seen it in the eyes of countless officers before him, who wielded their authority like a club, who saw her skin and her success as a challenge to their dominion. He approached her window, his flashlight beam harsh and invasive, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." She met his gaze, her expression calm, her tone even as she asked, "What's the reason for this stop, officer?" The question hung in the air, simple yet defiant, and something in Blake snapped. She didn't shrink, didn't stammer, didn't beg. She looked at him as if he were a speck of dust on her windshield, an annoyance to be brushed aside. Rage flared in his chest. How dare she? He'd done this dance before, countless times. The stops, the accusations, the veiled threats. He'd perfected the art of stripping people of their dignity while keeping his hands just clean, enough to dodge accountability. Kesha, with her luxury car and unflinching poise, was the perfect target. A black woman alone, late at night, an easy mark for his bruised ego to reclaim its footing. But Kesha didn't bend. When she hesitated, questioning his orders, he seized his moment. Obstruction. Disrespect. The words were hollow, flimsy excuses he'd used a dozen times before. But they were enough. The cuffs snapped around her wrists, cold metal biting into her skin. And for the first time that night, Blake felt the rush of power surge back into his veins. He smirked as he led her to his cruiser, her silence only fueling his triumph. At the station, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. A few officers glanced up as they entered, their eyebrows lifting in mild curiosity before returning to their paperwork. A black woman in cuffs, nothing new, just another night. Blake scribbled out the report with practiced ease, the charges vague enough to hold her, sharp enough to sting. He expected her to crumble, to sit in that holding cell and realize that all her degrees, her titles, her victories meant nothing against the weight of his badge. But Kesha wasn't just anyone. She sat with her spine straight, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her mind already turning over the pieces of this game. Blake had miscalculated, picked the wrong woman to break. Days later, the courtroom was a cauldron of tension, the air thick with anticipation. Kesha stood before the bench, still cuffed, her wrists chafed, but her spirit unbowed. Her tailored suit was slightly wrinkled from the ordeal, yet she wore it like armor, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. The judge, a weary man with silver hair and a perpetually stern demeanor, skimmed a note that had been slipped to him moments before. His fingers paused, his brow creasing as he absorbed its contents. Blake stood across the room, arms crossed, his broad frame filling out his neatly pressed uniform. His badge glinted under the lights, his holstered gun a silent reminder of his authority. He'd been here before, dredging men and women into this room with fabricated charges, watching them falter under a system rigged against them. He expected the same today, a quick ruling, a slap on Kesha's wrist, and a walk out the door with his power reaffirmed. But something was wrong. The judge's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he set the note aside. "Officer Blake, step forward," he said, his voice slicing through the silence like a guillotine. Blake obeyed, his boots thudding against the floor, his chest puffed with the certainty of a man who'd never been questioned. "Yes, Your Honor." His tone was laced with that same arrogance, the belief that this was just another formality. The judge fixed him with a stare that could have cracked stone. "You arrested Miss Robinson on charges of obstruction of justice." Blake nodded, his smirk barely concealed. "Correct, Your Honor. She was disrespectful, non-compliant, refused to address me properly, questioned my authority." The judge rubbed his temple, a sharp exhale escaping him as if the weight of Blake's words pressed against his skull. Kesha watched, her face a mask of composure, but inside, her mind raced. She'd tasted injustice before, felt its bitter sting in the sidelong glances, the dismissed ideas, the assumptions that her worth hinged on someone else's approval. But she also knew power, the kind that didn't roar but whispered, threading through networks and alliances Blake couldn't fathom. She'd built her life on that power, and now it was rising to meet her. The judge's voice cut through again. "Miss Robinson, do you have anything to add?" She stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her voice steady as steel. "No, Your Honor. I'll let the facts speak for themselves." And they did. The note's contents a mystery to Blake, but a lifeline to Kesha shifted everything. It wasn't just paper, it was a command, a thread pulled from the highest echelons of influence. The judge's eyes flicked to Blake, then back to Kesha, and when he spoke, the room tilted. "Officer Blake, these charges are dismissed. Furthermore, you're to report to Internal Affairs immediately. There's evidence suggesting a pattern of misconduct, and this court will not tolerate it." Blake's smirk vanished, his arms dropping to his sides as the ground beneath him seemed to fracture. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, a few gasps punctuating the stillness. Kesha allowed herself a single, measured breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of vindication. Justice had lingered, taken its winding path, but now it stood firm, a reckoning for a man who'd mistaken power for invincibility. In that moment, the lesson crystallized just for Blake, but for everyone watching. Power, when wielded as a weapon against the innocent, was a fragile thing. prone to shatter under the weight of its own excess. Kesha had never sought to destroy Blake. She'd simply let his arrogance build the scaffold of his downfall. She'd learned long ago that true strength lay in resilience, in outlasting the storms others brewed. Blake, meanwhile, had never questioned the system that propped him up until it turned on him. As he stood there, stripped of his swagger, facing the consequences of his abuse, the courtroom bore witness to a deeper truth. Justice might bend, might delay, but when it arrived, it was unrelenting. For Kesha, it was more than a victory. It was a testament to her father's words, her mother's sacrifices, and the unyielding fire she'd carried through a world that tried to dim her light. The cuffs fell away, and she walked out, not just free, but whole, her head high, her legacy etched in the silence of a humbled room. In the dimly lit courtroom, Officer Blake struggled to keep his rising frustration in check. His chest tightened as he stood before the judge, who sat behind the towering oak bench, his face a mask of barely contained exasperation. The judge's voice, unnervingly calm, yet laced with an edge sharp enough to cut through the thick tension, broke the silence. "Tell me, Officer Blake," he began, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood. "Do you even have the faintest idea who Miss Robinson is?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst, heavy with implication. Blake, standing tall in his crisp uniform, didn't hesitate. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of arrogance that betrayed his confidence in the system he'd always trusted to shield him. "She's a civilian," he replied smoothly, his tone dripping with dismissal. "Just someone who couldn't be bothered to follow orders from law enforcement." His words were casual, almost flippant, as if the matter were already settled in his favor. He shifted his weight slightly, hands resting on his duty belt, exuding the kind of self-assurance that came from years of bending the rules without consequence. The judge's response was immediate, a dry, humorless chuckle that echoed faintly off the courtroom walls. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of disbelief tinged with pity, and reached for a folded note resting on his desk. He tapped it against the surface once, twice, the sound crisp and deliberate, before setting it down with a quiet thud. "No, officer," he said, his voice dropping into a tone that carried the weight of authority and a hint of scorn. "She is not just a civilian. Miss Robinson is a senior intelligence officer at the Pentagon. Her security clearance outranks mine. You're Severians in this room." He paused, letting the revelation settle, his eyes narrowing as he watched Blake's reaction. A ripple of shock coursed through the courtroom. The spectators, a mix of restless reporters, curious onlookers, and stony-faced bailiffs, couldn't suppress their gasps. Whispers erupted like a sudden gust of wind, sharp and uncontainable, as the enormity of the judge's words sank in. Kesha Robinson stood off to the side, her posture still and composed, her dark eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime observing, calculating, waiting. She'd anticipated this moment, the unveiling of her identity, the shift in the air. It wasn't new to her, this underestimation. Her whole life had been a series of battles against people who saw her as less than she was. And now, watching the scene unfold, she felt a quiet vindication stir deep within her chest. Blake blinked, the smirk that had defined his demeanor faltering for the first time. His brows furrowed, and he shook his head slightly, as if trying to dislodge the judge's words from his mind. That can't be right," he muttered, his voice barely audible, cracking under the weight of his own disbelief. He took a half-step back, his polished boots scuffing faintly against the floor, his hands twitching at his sides. The confidence that had always been his armor was slipping, unraveling like a thread pulled too hard. "Fact," the judge snapped, cutting through Blake's denial with surgical precision. He leaned forward slightly, his robe rustling as he adjusted his position, his gaze unrelenting. "And there's more. I just received a direct order from the Department of Defense." He held up the note again, its edges creased from his grip, and let the words linger for effect. "Miss Robinson isn't just any intelligence officer. She operates at the highest levels of national security work so critical, so far beyond the scope of this courtroom, that it's frankly humbling to even consider. And do you know what happens when someone like her is wrongfully detained?" Blake's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the sound audible in the tense silence. His shoulders, once squared with pride, slumped as the realization began to seep in. The air seemed to leak out of him, his bravado deflating like a punctured tire on a desolate road. The judge's voice dropped lower, each syllable deliberate. Seething with a fury that simmered just beneath the surface. People lose their jobs, officer. People face investigations. People, he paused, his eyes locking onto Blake's, with an intensity that pinned the younger man in place, get removed. The word landed like a gavel strike, reverberating through the room. A warning and a promise wrapped into one. Blake stumbled back another step, his breathing uneven now, shallow and ragged. His hands same ones that had clamped cold steel cuffs around Kesha's wrists, with such casual author articuled into tight fists at his sides, knuckles whitening as he fought to steady himself. His mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of denial and panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd played this game before, countless times asserting his power, watching the system bend to his will. But now, the ground beneath him was shifting, crumbling, and he could feel it. Kesha remained motionless, her silence a weapon sharper than any words she could have spoken. She didn't need to gloat. The victory was already hers. Her wrists, still marked faintly from the cuffs, flexed slightly as she stood there, a pillar of quiet strength amid the storm she'd unleashed. The judge turned his attention to her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Miss Robinson," he said, his tone firm yet respectful, "you are free to go, effective immediately." This arrest was a mistake, a grievous one, that should never have occurred. A bailiff, a weary man with a nervous twitch in his jaw, hurried forward, fumbling with the keys as he unlocked the cuffs still dangling from one of Kesha's wrists. The metallic clink echoed faintly, a small sound that carried immense weight. Kesha exhaled slowly, a measured release of the tension she'd held inside, and rolled her wrists, savoring the freedom of movement. The room buzzed around her, the energy shifting palpably as whispers turned to murmurs, then to a low hum of awe and unease. She wasn't finished, thaw not yet. As she turned, her gaze locked onto Blake's, and for the first time, she saw something new flicker in his eyes, fear. Not just any fear, but the bone-deep kind that comes when a man realizes the power he's clung to his whole life has slipped through his fingers like sand. Blake took another step back, shaking his head as if he could will the moment away. This is a mistake," he whispered, his voice trembling, more a plea to himself than a statement to the room. Kesha adjusted her blazer, smoothing the sleeves with deliberate care, her movements calm and precise. Then, in a voice steady as steel, she spoke, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You have no idea what you've done." The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every breath, every rustle of fabric, every fleeting thought. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed entirely. Blake's once smug posture had disintegrated into something rigid, brittle, teetering on the edge of collapse. He could feel the judge's words pressing down on him, a suffocating weight that tightened around his throat like a noose. His mind spun, grasping for a lifeline, replaying the moments that had led him. Harris barked orders, the flash of defiance in Kesha's eyes, the cold click of the cuffs. He'd misjudged her, underestimated her, and now the consequences were barreling toward him with unstoppable force. Kesha stood there, her expression an enigma calm, unreadable, yet charged with an intensity that unnerved him. There was no triumph in her gaze, no petty satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that hinted at the storm she knew was coming. She didn't need to raise her voice or gesture wildly. Her presence alone spoke volumes. The room was alive with whispers now, a chorus of realization as the spectators began to piece together the magnitude of what was unfolding. Faces that had once watched her with indifference or disdain now darted glances of uncertainty, their eyes wide with the dawning awareness that they'd witnessed something far bigger than a routine hearing. Blake clenched his jaw, the muscles twitching as he fought the panic clawing up his chest. This wasn't how it worked, not for him. He'd seen it play out 1,000 times. A person of color in cuffs, a judge who barely blinked, a system that tilted in his favor no matter the truth. He'd banked on it, built his career on it. But now, the judge's stare was piercing, colder than ice, and the courtroom officersmen he'd shared coffee with, swapped stories with, were eyeing him like he was the one in the wrong. His palms grew clammy, the sweat beating at his collar as the reality sank in. He wasn't untouchable anymore. The judge's voice sliced through the silence again, each word a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of dread through Blake's core. Officer Blake, your actions here tonight have not only been called into question, they're now under immediate federal investigation. Do you understand what that entails? Blake stiffened, his mouth opening and then snapping shut. He knew better than to speak, knew that every syllable could be twisted against him. Yet the urge to defend himself gnawed at him, a desperate itch he couldn't scratch. Your Honor, he managed, forcing the words out. With all due respect, I was just doing my job. The judge's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint, incredulous sneer. Your job, he echoed, the question dripping with disdain. Tell me, officer, does your job include concocting charges out of thin air? Does it include wielding your badge like a club to detain an innocent woman, simply because she didn't bow to the deference you think you're owed? Blake's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He needed to regain control, to claw his way out of this freefall, but the judge's words were relentless, pinning him in place. I followed protocol, he insisted, his voice strained but steady. She was uncooperative. She refused to comply. That's obstruction. A sharp, disbelieving scoff burst from the judge, cutting through Blake's defense like a knife. No, officer, what she did was ask a question, a simple, reasonable one. What you did was turn your authority into a weapon against someone who posed no threat, someone you misjudged entirely. And worst of all, you picked the wrong target. Blake's stomach twisted, a sickening churn that left him dizzy. The wrong target, the phrase echoed in his mind, its meaning elusive yet terrifying. He didn't fully grasp it, but the judge's glare, Kesha's unwavering stare, and the weight of the room told him enough. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Then the courtroom doors swung open with a soft creak, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. They moved with a quiet, practiced precision, their polished shoes clicking faintly against the tile floor. Their faces were stone, unreadable, betraying nothing as they strode toward the judge's bench. One of them handed over a crisp sheet of paper, then stepped back to join his partner, standing like sentinels awaiting orders. The judge took the document, his eyes scanning the text with slow, deliberate focus. He inhaled deeply, the sound heavy with finality, and looked up at Blake. Officer Blake, he said, his voice measured now, almost eerily calm. I've just received confirmation from the Department of Defense. Miss Robinson's wrongful detainment is being classified as interference with national security. Blake's entire body went cold, a shiver racing down his spine. Excuse me. The words slipped out, thin and fragile, his voice cracking at the edges. The judge didn't flinch, didn't even glance up from the paper. National security interference. He repeated, each syllable a nail in Blake's coffin. What you did tonight, this arrest, this flagrant abuse of powerhouse escalated far beyond this courtroom, beyond this jurisdiction. This is now a federal matter. Blake stumbled back, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking into his collar. The pressure in his chest so tight he could barely breathe. That's ridiculous, he choked out, shaking his head wildly. This is being blown out of proportion. She was. Kesha's voice cut through the chaos, smooth and controlled, a stark contrast to Blake's unraveling. It was the first time she'd spoken since her release, and the room fell silent, every head turning to her. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor, closing the distance between them with deliberate grace. She was what? She asked, her tone deceptively light, her head tilting slightly as she studied him. I'd love to hear how you were about to justify this. Her words were a challenge, a quiet dare that hung between them, and Blake froze, his mouth dry, his mind blank. He had no answer, not one that could save him now. The lesson was clear, etched into every moment of this unfolding drama. Justice, when ignored, has a way of catching up, and power, when misused, carries a cost steeper than anyone can predict. For Blake, the consequences were just beginning, a shadow lengthening over his life with every tick of the clock. For Kesha, it was a reminder of the strength she'd always carried, a strength that no cuffs, no badge, no courtroom could strip away. Blake's head tilted ever so slightly, a nervous twitch betraying the storm brewing beneath his carefully maintained facade. His eyes locked onto Kesha's, unblinking, as if staring into an abyss that stared right back. His throat tightened, his pulse thudding so hard he could feel it reverberating against his collarbone. A relentless drumbeat of dread. "Please, enlighten me," she said, her voice soft but piercing, slicing through the tension that hung thick in the air of the courtroom. Her words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a guillotine poised and ready to fall. Blake swallowed hard, the bitter taste of panic rising in his mouth as Kesha took a deliberate step closer, her shoes clicking faintly against the polished wood floor. The sound echoed in the stillness, a quiet harbinger of the reckoning unfolding before him. "You thought you could pull this off, didn't you?" she murmured, her tone almost reflective, as though she were piecing together a puzzle she'd already solved. She paused, letting the silence stretch, her gaze unwavering as it bore into him. "You figured it'd be easy because you've gotten away with it before. You assumed no one would dare challenge you, that I'd just sit there, meek and silent, swallowing whatever you dished out. That by the time I had a chance to open my mouth, it'd be too late for my voice to matter." Her words dripped with a calm certainty, each one landing like a stone tossed into still water, rippling outward to disturb the fragile surface of Blake's composure. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening as his nails dug into his palms, a futile attempt to anchor himself against the tide of her accusations. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, his mind racing for a defense, a way to wrest back control. "You don't," he started, his voice rough and trembling. But Kesha cut him off with a sharpness that made the air feel colder. "No, Blake, you don't get to talk anymore." Her tone remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of steel in it, a quiet authority that pressed against his ribs like a physical force. "You don't get to twist this story to suit you. You don't get to stand there pretending you're anything other than what you've always been, a man who thought his badge was a crown." The room fell into a profound silence, so heavy it seemed to swallow every sound except the faint rustle of the judge's robes. As he shifted in his seat, even he, perched high on his bench, said nothing, his weathered face impassive as he observed the scene, with the detachment of someone watching a play unfold. His gavel rested untouched, a silent witness to Kesha's unraveling of Blake's world. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow cut deeper than a shout. "You don't get to rewrite this," she said, her words precise and surgical, carving through the last vestiges of his defiance. "Not this time." Blake's breath came to fast now, ragged and uneven, his head spinning as the walls of the courtroom seemed to tilt inward. He needed air, needed a way out, needed to claw his way back to the safety of the power he'd always known. But before he could grasp at any lifeline, two men in crisp suits emerged from the edges of the room, their movements smooth and deliberate, like shadows given form. They stepped forward with an authority that dwarfed his own, their polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. "Officer Blake," one of them said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, a monotone that carried the weight of inevitability. "You are hereby placed on immediate administrative suspension, effective now, pending a full federal investigation into your conduct." The words hit Blake like a physical blow, freezing him in place. His mouth opened, but all that came out was a hoarse "no." His voice cracked, desperation seeping into the single syllable. "No, you can't do this," the agent continued, unfazed by his protest, his expression as blank as a stone wall. "You will be escorted from this courtroom and relieved of duty until further notice. Failure to comply will result in immediate detainment." Blake's head whipped toward the judge, his eyes wide and pleading, silently begging for intervention, for some remnant of the system he'd always trusted to shield him. But the judge offered nothing. His hands moved slowly, stacking papers with a methodical calm, his face betraying no hint of sympathy or concern. Blake's gaze darted to Kesha, and she met it with an unflinching stillness. There was no anger in her eyes, no trace of spite or triumph, just a quiet, unshakable certainty that rooted her in place like an oak weathering a storm. His mouth worked soundlessly, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. But no words came. Then the men in suits closed in, their hands firm as they gripped his arms. The contact jolted him, and in that instant, everything he'd built, every ounce of authority he'd wielded, every illusion of invincibility trembled like a house of cards caught in a gust. His breaths came in sharp, jagged gasps as they began to lead him away, their hold unyielding, their steps measured and precise. His polished boots dragged against the floor, the sound harsh and grating, as if the very ground beneath him had turned hostile. "Wait," he cried, his voice breaking into a raw, frantic plea as they pulled him past the judge's bench. The confidence that had once defined him was gone, stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of the man he'd been. "This is wrong. I didn't do anything." He twisted his head, searching desperately for the judge's eyes, for some flicker of the influence he'd once commanded. But the judge didn't look up. His focus remained on the papers before him, his movements slow and deliberate, as if Blake had already faded into irrelevance. The courtroom, once a stage where he'd held sway, now felt like a cavernous void, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling closing in to swallow him whole. Kesha stood motionless, her hands loose at her sides, her posture relaxed yet radiating a quiet power. Her face was a mask of calm, unreadable, but her eyes followed him with a steady intensity that made his stomach churn. Blake's desperation boiled over, and he turned his fury on her. "Yo, why you did this?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "You set me up." Kesha tilted her head slightly, studying him with a detached curiosity, as if he were a specimen under glass. "I set this up," she echoed, her voice smooth and measured, letting the absurdity of his accusation hang in the air. "You mean I orchestrated you pulling me over? I forced you to slap cuffs on my wrists. I dragged you into this courtroom and made you lie under oath." She paused, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, not one of victory, but of pity. "No, Officer Blake, you built this trap all by yourself." His pulse hammered against his skull, a deafening roar in his ears. He'd always had an outsmooth words, a wink and a nod from the department, the union's unwavering support. The system had cradled him, cushioned his every misstep. But now, as the men in suits tightened their grip and the reality of his isolation sank in, panic clawed at his chest like a caged animal desperate to break free. "You're blowing this out of proportion." He tried again, his voice splittering under the strain. "I didn't know who you were. If I'd known." He stopped short, the words slipping out before he could catch them, and Kesha's eyes sharpened, a glint of something fierce flashing within them. "If you'd known what?" she asked, her voice low and deliberate, each syllable laced with a quiet menace. "You'd have treated me differently." Blake flinched, the air growing thick and suffocating around him. His own admission hung there, a noose tightening around his neck, and he couldn't take it back. The room pressed in, the faces of his colleagues and allies, now strangers blurring into a sea of averted eyes and stiff shoulders. No one moved to help him. No one spoke. The silence was a judgment all its own, and it bore down on him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Kesha stepped closer, her presence filling the space between them. "You'd have let me go if you'd known who I was, wouldn't you?" she said, her tone deceptively soft. "Because in your world, respect isn't a given, it's a privilege, something people have to earn. And people like me, we don't get it unless we prove we're worth it, unless we're someone you can't ignore." Her words settled into the air, heavy and unyielding, and Blake's throat closed up, his rebuttal dying before it could form. "How many others like me have you crushed under that badge?" she continued, her voice rising just enough to carry through the room. "How many times have you let your power excuse your bias? How many lives have you upended, secure in the knowledge that no one would ever call you out?" The questions hung there, sharp and accusing, and Blake yanked against the hands holding him, frustration twisting into something raw and ugly. "I was just doing my job," he barked, his voice hoarse and breaking. "I was doing what I was trained to do." Kesha didn't flinch, but the slight shake of her head sent a shiver racing down his spine. "No," she said, her voice colder now, cutting through his excuses like a blade. "You were doing what you could get away with. There's a difference." The words landed with finality, and the silence that followed was suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. The agent on his left spoke again, his tone clipped and professional. "Officer Blake, per federal mandate, you are placed on immediate leave pending a thorough investigation into your actions." You will surrender your badge and service weapon. Any interference with this process will result in further consequences." Blake's eyes widened, his breath catching as the reality crashed over him like a wave. "Wait, what? You can't," he stammered, but the agent's gaze was unyielding. His hand extended expectantly. Blake's trembling fingers fumbled at his belt, the badge's familiar weight suddenly unbearable. He stared at it, his distorted reflection staring back from its gleaming surface, man he barely recognized. Reluctantly, he let it fall into the agent's palm, the soft clink of metal against skin ringing in his ears like a death knell. Then came the gun. His hand hovered over it, fingers brushing the cool steel, clinging to the last shred of his identity. It was more than a weapon, it was his shield, his proof of dominance, the tangible symbol of the life he'd known. But as the agent's grips tightened and the courtroom watched in stony silence, he knew there was no holding on. His fingers loosened, and the gun slipped from his grasp, leaving his hands empty and his soul hollow. The men in suits turned him toward the exit, and as they led him away, the lesson burned into his mind. Justice, when it came, spared no one, not even those who thought themselves above it. Power, so easily abused, was a fragile thing, and its collapse left nothing but the wreckage of a man who'd never seen it coming. The cuffs bit into Officer Blake's wrists, the cold metal tightening once more as the agents pivoted him toward the courtroom exit. His boots scuffed the polished wood floor, a sound swallowed by the hum of the room he was leaving behind. He stole one last look over his shoulder, his eyes darting across the scene like a man grasping for something to hold onto. The judge sat perched at the bench, his black robe a stark silhouette against the warm oak paneling. Already engrossed in the next case, his gavel resting idle, the officers Blake had once called his brothers stood scattered along the walls, their navy uniforms crisp, their faces carved from stone, unreadable, distant, as though they'd never shared a laugh over coffee in the precinct break room. And there, in the center of it all, was Kesha Robinson. She stood rooted to the spot, her posture unyielding, her dark coat draped over her shoulders like a quiet declaration of resolve. As Blake was dragged past her, their eyes locked for a fleeting, electric moment. He searched her gaze for something, vindication, anything to fuel the fire raging in his chest, but found only a steady, unshakable certainty. That calm pierced him deeper than any taunt could have. It wasn't triumph she carried. It was the weight of knowing she'd seen this end coming long before he'd even stepped into the trap he'd built for himself. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, twin slabs of mahogany that groaned under their own weight as they swung shut behind him. The sound reverberated through the empty hallway, a deep, hollow thud that rattled in his skull like the closing of a tomb. For the first time in his 38 years, Blake felt the ground beneath him dissolve, leaving him adrift in a void where power, respect, and certainty had once anchored him. The air in the corridor hit him hard, sharp, and frigid, slicing through the sweat-soaked fabric of his uniform. It punched the breath from his lungs, leaving his chest tight, his movements jerky, as though his body couldn't reconcile the absence of the badge that had defined him. That phantom weight lingered, a cruel echo of the shield he'd worn with pride, now stripped away in a room full of witnesses. The hallway stretched out before him, its marble tiles gleaming under fluorescent lights, eerily silent where there should have been the bustle of clerks shuffling papers, or the low murmur of officers swapping stories. Each step he took echoed back at him, a solitary rhythm that mocked his isolation. He'd never felt small before it in the towering shadow of a suspect, not in the chaos of a late-night call, but now, flanked by the agents, he was a man teetering on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss with no rope to pull him back. The agents moved with a deliberate calm, their black suits crisp, their grips firm but unhurried, guiding him forward as though this were routine. Yet every step felt like a march toward a guillotine, each one heavier, more final than the last. Blake's mind churned, a storm of fragmented thoughts clawing at the edges of his sanity. This couldn't be real, not for him, not after everything he'd built. He'd done what any cop would do, hadn't he? He'd flexed his authority, put that woman, that arrogant, defiant Kesha Robinson, in her place. He'd shown her who held the power, who made the rules. It was a dance he'd performed 1,000 times, a sharp word, a flash of cuffs, a reminder of the line between them, Only this time, the music had stopped, and he'd tripped over the wrong partner. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scrambled for a life-linsome excuse, some justification to claw his way back from the edge. He'd been in control, always in control. How had it unraveled so fast? How had she turned the tables without even raising her voice? They reached the main exit, and the double doors parted to reveal a cluster of familiar face officers. He'd shared patrol cars with, swapped beers with after long shifts. Men who'd had his back through years of chaos. They stood near the threshold, hands in pockets or crossed over chests, their eyes skimming the floor or flickering to each other. Anywhere but him. No one spoke. No one offered a nod, a grimace, a shred of the brotherhood that had once been his armor. A few muttered under their breath, their words lost in the shuffle of footsteps. But the silence from the rest was louder, sharper, a blade twisting in his gut. The camaraderie he'd taken for granted late-night diner runs. The unspoken pact that they'd always stand together was slipping away, crumbling like dry earth through his clenched fists, his jaw locked tight, his voice scraping out rough and raw, teetering on the edge of desperation. "This isn't over," he growled, his eyes darting to the agent on his right, searching for a crack in the man's stoic mask, some hint that this could still be undone. "You hear me? I'll fight this. I have rights, you can't just..." The agent didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head. His voice came flat, mechanical, cutting through Blake's rising panic like a dull blade. "You'll have your due process. Officer Blake, just like everyone else." Blake's breath hitched, a sharp exhale hissing through his teeth as his jaw clenched harder. "I'm not like everyone else," he snapped, the words spilling out before he could stop them. And it was true, wasn't it? He'd never been one of the masses, never stood on the other side of the line. He'd been the one with the badge, the one with the power to shape the narrative, to decide who walked free and who didn't. He'd held the reins, dictated the outcomes, basked in the unspoken privilege of never being questioned. But now, as the doors swung wide and the harsh midday sun blasted his face, that illusion shattered. The world beyond the courthouse felt al liente air thick with the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. The sounds of traffic and distant voices grating against his raw nerves. Reporters swarmed the steps below, a writhing mass of microphones and flashing cameras, their shouts blending into a chaotic roar. "Officer Blake, are you under arrest? Do you have a statement about Kesha Robinson's wrongful detainment? What's your response to the allegations of racial bias and abuse of power?" The questions came fast, relentless, each one a hammer blow to the fragile shell of his composure. How had words spread so quickly? How had his downfall become a public feast in the span of minutes? The agents pressed forward, their movements smooth and practiced, parting the crowd with quiet efficiency as Blake stumbled between them. His name rang out from every corner, a chant that sliced through the air and left him reeling. His head throbbed, a dull ache pulsing behind his eyes. He wanted to shout back, to shift through the throng, to reclaim some fragment of the authority that had been ripped from him. But the weight of it all, his own missteps, the cameras documenting every faltering step, the eyes of strangers who now saw him not as a cop, but as a pariah pinned him in place, a statue of rage and shame. And then he saw her again. Kesha Robinson stood at the foot of the steps, alone in the chaos. Her figure a still point amid the storm. No security flanked her. No press team hovered at her elbow. She was just there, her dark eyes steady, her chin lifted slightly, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. Blake's chest constricted, a molten mix of fury and humiliation searing through him. He hated that look, not smug, not victorious, but certain, as though she'd mapped out every move of this chess game while he'd been fumbling with pawns. She'd known, hadn't she, from the moment he'd snapped those cuffs on her wrists. From the second he'd sneered and told her to know her place, she'd seen this coming. And she hadn't needed to fight back, not with fists or words. She'd simply waited, letting his own arrogance dig the grave he now stood in. His voice came low, a jagged whisper that barely carried over the clamor. "You did this to me." Kesha didn't blink. Her gaze held his, unflinching, a mirror reflecting every choice he'd made. "No," she said, her tone even, deliberate. "You did this to yourself." He lurched forward, a reflexive surge of defiance, but the agent's hands tightened on his arms, their fingers digging into muscle with a silent warning. He wasn't calling the shots anymore. His breath came sharp and ragged as he forced himself to stand straighter, to scrape together the last scraps of his pride. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he muttered, venom dripping from every syllable. "Because one day, people like me will be back in control." Kesha's lips curved, not a smile, but something fiercer, more resolute. "People like you," she echoed, her voice a calm blade cutting through his bluster. "People like you have been in control for a long time, Officer Blake." She tilted her head, a subtle shift that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of patience. "But you made a mistake." Her words landed heavy, sinking into him like stones. "You assumed no one was watching." His breath snagged in his throat, a sharp, painful catch. She pressed on, her voice steady, unhurried, each sentence a brick in the wall building around him. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted, that there'd be no consequences. But the world's changed. People are tired. They're paying attention now. And when they serially see what's been happening, what's always been happening, there's no going back." Blake's hands balled into fists, nails biting into his palms, until he felt the sting of broken skin. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to tear apart her quiet certainty with his own version of the truth. But what could he say? What words could erase the footage already circulating? The witnesses who'd stepped forward, the undeniable proof of his own overreach. The reporters surged closer, their cameras clicking like a swarm of insects, their voices overlapping in a frantic crescendo. "Kesha Robinson, do you have a statement? What do you think of Officer Blake's suspension? Do you believe justice has been served?" They pressed in, hungry for her words. But Kesha didn't turn to them. She didn't shift her stance or raise her voice for their benefit. Her eyes stayed locked on Blake, her next words slicing through the din with effortless clarity. "Justice," she repeated, her tone soft but piercing. "This isn't justice. This is just the beginning." Blake's stomach twisted into a knot, a sickening churn that spread through his core. This wasn't the end, not for him, not for her, not for the world now watching with rapt attention. The reporters' voices blurred into a relentless hum, their flashes a staccato assault of light that carved the moment into stark relief. The weight of their questions hung thick in the air, demanding accountability, demanding answers he couldn't give. Kesha remained a pillar of composure, her expression a quiet testament to the power of those who'd been underestimated for too long. Blake's breathing grew shallow, erratic, his mind racing to process the collapse of everything he'd known. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to push back against the tide swallowing him whole. But the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. In that moment, the lesson burned clear. Power, when wielded without restraint, invited its own downfall. Blake had swung his authority like a club, blind to the eyes tracking his every move, deaf to the whispers growing into a roar. Justice wasn't just a verdict handed down in a courtroom, it was a reckoning. A slow tide that eroded the foundations of those who thought themselves untouchable. Kesha hadn't needed to strike back. She'd simply stood firm, letting Blake's own actions topple him. And as the agents pulled him further into the chaos he'd sown, the truth settled heavy on his shoulders. The consequences of abusing power didn't just destroy the moment, they reshaped the world that came after. Blake had spent years observing the downfall of others, watching from a safe distance as men lost everything they'd built, their power stripped away, their careers dismantled, their reputations reduced to ashes in the blink of an eye. He'd seen it unfold like a grim theater production, the proud brought low, the mighty humbled, their lives unraveling thread by thread. Yet, in all that time, the thought that he might one day join their ranks had never crossed his mind. He'd been untouchable, a man cloaked in the armor of authority, insulated by a system he believed would always bend to shield him. Now, as he stood in the aftermath of his own reckoning, that armor felt like a hollow shell, cracking under the weight of a reality he couldn't outrun. His voice, when it finally broke free, rasped with an edge of desperation he barely recognized as his own. "You don't get it," he muttered, his eyes locking onto Kesha with a ferocity born of crumbling pride. Once, his confidence had been a fortress, solid, unyielding, a towering presence that commanded respect without effort. Now, it frayed at the seams, unraveling with every word he forced out. You think this changes something? You think this means you've won? His chest tightened as he spoke, a storm of frustration and disbelief swirling within him. Clawing for an outlet, Kesha stood before him, her expression an unreadable mask. She didn't flinch, didn't shift her weight or offer the smallest hint of a reaction. She didn't need to. Her silence was a blade, cutting deeper than any retort could have. Blake's frustration sharpened into something jagged, a bitter edge he could taste on his tongue. The system protects people like me, he pressed, his voice dropping low, thick with a conviction that felt more like a plea. His hands clenched at his sides, fingers twitching as if grasping for the certainty that had always anchored him. It always has. You think one hearing gone stupid mistake's going to rewrite that? You think I won't claw my way back? He leaned forward slightly, daring her to challenge him, to give him something tangible to fight against. For a long moment, Kesha said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, she blinked, her gaze sweeping over his face like a scientist studying a specimen under glass. She exhaled, a measured breath that carried the weight of inevitability. You still don't understand, do you? Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sliced through the chaos of the moment with effortless precision. This was never about whether you come back. It's about making damn sure people like you can't hide in the shadows anymore. Her words hung in the air, heavy with purpose, and Blake felt them settle into his bones like a cold, unshakable truth. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin as he fought the urge to lash out. He hated the way she looked at him, calm, detached, as if she'd already mapped out every twist and turn of this confrontation and found him wanting. It wasn't pity in her eyes, nor anger, but something worse, a quiet certainty that rendered him insignificant. He wanted her to rage, to scream, to give him a target for the fury boiling inside him. But she offered nothing, no crack in her composure, no fuel for his fire, just that suffocating, unshakable resolve. You're naive, he spat, shaking his head as if he could dislodge the unease creeping up his spine. People like me don't vanish, we adapt. The headlines fade, the outrage burns out, and the world spins on. You really think anyone's going to care about this a year from now? His voice trembled with defiance, but beneath it lurked a thread of doubt he couldn't quite silence. Kesha tilted her head, a subtle movement that somehow carried more weight than a shout. Maybe they won't, she conceded, her tone even, almost conversational. Maybe they'll forget your name in time. Maybe your face will blur into just another story they scroll past. But what they won't forget, what they can't erase, is what they saw. She paused, letting the words sink in, her eyes never leaving his. They saw you, Blake. They saw what you did. They saw what people like you get away with. And once people serially see, there's no going back. Blake swallowed hard, the motion scraping against the raw dryness in his throat. It felt like shards of glass tumbling down, cutting deeper with every breath. He wanted to argue, to hurl her words back in her face, to find some flaw in her reasoning he could cling to like a lifeline. But nothing came. Deep down, buried beneath layers of resentment and denial, a quiet, gnawing truth stirred. She was right. For years, he'd thrived in the shadows, banking on the silence of those too afraid or too indifferent to speak. He'd counted on the way people averted their eyes, excused his excesses, justified his abuses. That silence had been his shield, his sanctuary. Now it was shattering, and in its place blazed a spotlight he couldn't extinguish. Kesha didn't need to say more. Her point was made, carved into the air between them with surgical precision. She turned, stepping away from him with the same grace she'd carried into the courtroom hours earlier, composure that seemed to mock his unraveling. The press surged toward her, a swarm of flashing cameras and shouted questions, but she moved through them unruffled, her pace steady, her head high. She didn't rush or falter, she let them capture every moment, knowing the story had already slipped beyond her control and into the hands of those who'd witnessed it unfold. Blake remained rooted in place, his feet heavy as if cemented to the ground. Agents flanked him, their hands firm but impersonal as they guided him toward a waiting vehicle. The short walk stretched into an eternity, each step a labored effort, the concrete beneath him seeming to tilt with every movement. Whispers buzzed around him, a low hum of judgment from the crowd he refused to acknowledge. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to meet the gazes boring into him. though he didn't need to see their faces to feel the weight of their thoughts. For years, he'd been the one looking down, perched atop a pedestal of power, peering at the world through a lens of superiority. Now, the tables had turned, and the world stared back, its collective gaze cold and unrelenting. The car door swung open, and the agents gestured for him to climb inside. His hands trembled as he complied, the metal frame of the vehicle cold against his skin. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in his chest, severing him from the chaos outside. In an instant, the clamor of the crowd vanished, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against his eardrums. He closed his eyes, drawing a sharp breath, but there was no escaping the suffocating weight that had settled over him. For the first time in his life, Blake wasn't the one pulling the strings, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at him like a living thing. Inside the car, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of leather and tension. Blake sat stiffly in the back seat, his shoulders squared, his hands pressed hard against his knees as if anchoring himself. Could somehow tether him to the life he'd known. The agents in the front were statuesque, stoic, their attention fixed on the road ahead, indifferent to the tempest raging within their passenger. The city streaked past the window in a blur of gray and glass, but Blake barely registered it. His mind was a cacophony, a relentless churn of thoughts and memories, each one laced with the bitter sting of loss. His badge, his gun, his career symbols of the authority he'd wielded like a birthright were gone, ripped away in a single, devastating blow. He'd spent years striding through these streets, a king in his own domain, his presence a quiet threat that demanded obedience. Now, as the car wound deeper into Washington's labyrinth of power, he saw the city anew, its towering buildings looming like sentinels, its shadows stretching long and unforgiving. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He couldn't let this be the end. He had connections, favors owed, strings he could still pull. If he could just get ahead of the narrative, reshape it before it solidified into something he couldn't escape, he might survive this. Time, that's all he needed. Time to think, to plan, to fight. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The agent in the passenger seat didn't turn, didn't even glance back. "You'll be briefed when we arrive," came the curt reply, flat and unyielding. Blake's jaw tightened, a slow burn of frustration simmering in his chest. This is ridiculous. He snapped, not under arrest. Silence greeted him, thick and dismissive. He inhaled sharply, forcing calm into his voice. "I have rights. If this is an investigation, I want my union rep. I want." The driver spoke for the first time, his tone level, devoid of warmth. "Your department's already cut you loose. Your union's waiting to see how this shakes out before they decide if you're worth the trouble. Right now, you're on your own." The words hit like a punch to the gut. On his own. Blake's stomach twisted, a sickening lurch that threatened to swallow him whole. He'd never been alone and not like this. He'd always been part of something bigger, cocooned within a system that protected its own, no matter the cost. He'd watched accusations against officers vanish into the ether, buried under layers of paperwork and well-timed denials. Bad press was a fleeting storm cloud one day, gone the next. But now he was the story, the headline, the sacrificial lamb cast out to appease the mob. "This is political," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. No response. He exhaled sharply, leaning back against the seat. "It's a damn witch hunt," he muttered, more to himself than to the agents. "They need a scapegoat. And I'm it. That's all this is." His jaw clenched as he continued, his words gaining heat. "I know how this game works. The media grabs one incident, blows it out of proportion, and suddenly everyone's out for blood. They want an example, a head on a pike. But I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. The public forgets. They always do." The passenger side agent shifted, turning just enough for Blake to catch his profile. "That's what you're banking on, isn't it?" the man said, his voice calm, almost curious. "That time will smooth this over. That people will get bored, move on, and the system will snap back to protect you like it always has." He paused, then turned fully, his eyes meeting Blake's in the rearview mirror. "Maybe it will, but that doesn't change what's happening right now, does it?" Blake held his gaze, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He'd built his life on that belief that men like him didn't fall, not for good. The system had its flaws, its fissures, but it always righted itself, always found a way to cradle those who enforced its rules, no matter how broken those rules might be. Yet the agent's stare pierced through that certainty, sending a shiver down Blake's spine that he couldn't shake. "Tell me something," the agent continued, his voice a quiet challenge. "Do you even?" The question hung unfinished, but it didn't need to be completed. Blake knew what he was asking. Did he regret it? Did he feel the weight of his actions? The lives he'd bent and broken under the guise of power? The answer churned within him, a tangled mess of defiance and doubt he wasn't ready to unravel. Outside, the city loomed larger, its streets a maze of consequences closing in around him. Kesha's words echoed in his mind. Once people serially see there's no going back. She'd been right about that, too. The lesson was brutal, unyielding, justice when it came. Didn't care about titles or connections. And the abuse of power, once exposed, left scars that time couldn't eradicate for the victims, and not for the man who'd wielded it. Blake's world had shifted, and as the car rolled on into the unknown, he realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer its master. Blake slumped back in the passenger seat, the worn leather creaking under his weight as he let out a bitter scoff. His arms crossed tightly over his chest, a shield against the storm brewing inside him. "You really expect me to understand why this is happening?" he muttered, his voice dripping with defiance. "All this because some stuffed suit at the Pentagon picked up a phone and barked an order?" The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, as if they could slice through the tension filling the car. The agent beside him didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on Blake, studying him with a quiet intensity that made the hair on the back of Blake's neck prickle. After what felt like an eternity, the agent shook his head slowly, deliberately, his lips parting to deliver a blow far heavier than Blake had braced for. "No," he said, his tone low and measured, each syllable sinking into Blake's bones. "This is happening because, for once in your miserable life, you pulled this on someone who could hit back." The words slammed into Blake like a fist to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. His bravado faltered, crumbling under the weight of that simple, devastating truth. The agent turned his attention back to the road ahead, the hum of the engine filling the silence as the tires devoured the asphalt. Blake stared out the window, watching the blurred outlines of trees and streetlights streak past. But his mind was elsewhere, reeling, spinning, unraveling. "If you'd done this to anyone else," the agent continued, his voice cutting through the haze, "it'd just be another forgotten file, stuffed into some dusty cabinet at the precinct. Another number in a ledger no one bothers to read. But you didn't. You chose her." Blake's throat tightened, a cold, leaden knot forming in his chest as the name surfaced in his mind like a ghost stepping out of the shadows. Kesha Robinson. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in his own ears, and tried to push the memory down, but it wouldn't stay buried. Back then, when he'd snapped the cuffs on her wrists, she'd been nothing to him. Just another faceless figure in a long line of people he'd silenced. Another insignificant speck he could brush aside without a second thought. He hadn't even bothered to commit her name to memory. To him, she'd been an obstacle, a nuisance, a momentary annoyance in the grand tapestry of his authority. Not a person, not someone with a life, a story, a voice. And that, he realized now with a sickening twist in his stomach, was the root of it all. For years, he'd moved through the world like a king, wielding his badge as a scepter, his power as a birthright. He'd trampled over people too many to count, leaving them bruised and broken in his wake, never once glancing back to see the wreckage. It had been so easy, so routine, that he'd stopped noticing the humanity in their eyes. But now, as the car rolled through the night, the tables had turned with a brutal, unyielding finality. For the first time, he was the one who didn't matter, the one reduced to a pawn in someone else's game. The irony tasted like ash in his mouth. The vehicle slowed, its tires crunching against gravel as they pulled up to a looming government building. The structure stood like a fortress, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but darkness, its entrance flanked by armed guards whose silhouettes blended into the shadows. Blake's pulse quickened, hammering against his ribs as a bead of sweat traced a slow path down his spine. This wasn't routine. This wasn't a slap on the wrist or a stern lecture from a superior. This was something else, something bigger. Something that reeked of consequences he couldn't yet fathom. The agents climbed out first, their boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and waited, their faces unreadable. Blake hesitated, his hand lingering on the door handle for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if he could delay the inevitable. Then, with a sharp breath, he stepped onto the pavement. The moment his feet touched solid ground, the heavy doors of the building swung open, revealing a dimly lit lobby that seemed to swallow the light around it. And there she was, Kesha Robinson, standing just beyond the threshold. Her posture was calm, almost casual, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Her expression gave nothing away, a mask of neutrality that somehow made her presence all the more commanding. But her ice-toast piercing, unflinching eyes locked onto his, and Blake felt his stomach lurch. There was no shock in her gaze, no hint of being caught off guard. She'd known he'd end up here, dragged before her like a trophy of her triumph. She'd been waiting. Blake's fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to hold her stare. "You really think this is over?" he growled, his voice rough and low, laced with a defiance he barely felt anymore. Kesha didn't flinch, didn't blink. "No," she replied, her tone as steady as stone. "I think this is just the beginning." The words landed between them like a boulder dropped into still water, sending ripples of dread through Blake's core. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he understood. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a reckoning, a tide he couldn't outrun. Later, Blake sat alone in a sterile, windowless room, the cold steel table before him reflecting the harsh fluorescent light overhead. His hands rested on its surface, fingers splayed, trembling faintly despite his efforts to steady them. The air was thick, oppressive, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and warped your sense of time. The chair beneath him was rigid, its edges digging into his thighs, but he barely registered the discomfort. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying every step, every choice, every moment that had led him to this desolate place, his badge gone, his career a smoldering ruin, his namiance a symbol of authoritino, a whispered curse, synonymous with shame. He'd spent years striding into rooms with his head high, his chest puffed out, cloaked in the untouchable certainty that came with power. People had parted for him, their voices hushed, their eyes averted. Respect had followed him like a shadow. But now, stripped of all that, he was just another broken man, sitting on the wrong side of the table, waiting for someone else to dictate his fate. The reversal gnawed at him, a relentless ache that burrowed deeper with every passing second. The door creaked open, and Kesha stepped inside. Her movements were deliberate, each step a quiet assertion of control. She carried herself with an effortless authority that didn't need to shout, it simply was. She settled into the chair across from him, placing a thick folder onto the table with a soft thud that echoed in the barren room. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let it wrap around Blake like a noose, tightening with every breath he took. He clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together, determined not to crack under her gaze, not to give her the satisfaction of seeing how thoroughly she'd undone him. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "Your department's washed their hands of you," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "The union won't lift a finger. You're facing a federal investigation, civil rights violations, misconduct, the works. There'll be hearings, trials, consequences. This isn't just about your job anymore, Blake. This is about who you've been." Blake's breath escaped in a sharp, ragged burst, his head shaking as if he could dispel her words. "I did my job," he rasped, the words scraping against his throat. "I did what I was trained to do." His voice was raw, hollowed out by exhaustion and desperation. But even as he said it, he knew it was a flimsy shield against the truth bearing down on him. Kesha leaned forward, just enough to close the distance between them, her gaze unwavering. "No," she countered, her voice steady as steel. "You did what you thought you could get away with." The accusation landed like a blade, slicing through the last threads of his defiance. His fists tightened against the table, knuckles whitening. But the fire that had once fueled him was gone. All that remained was a bone-deep weariness, a creeping realization that there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to salvage. His world had collapsed, and no amount of stubborn denial could piece it back together. Kesha let the silence settle again, heavy and suffocating, before she pressed on. "You want to know the difference between us?" she asked, her tone shifting to something almost reflective. "You spent your whole career lording over people, making them afraid, making them feel small. You thought authority was about control, about bending others to your will. But real power, it's not built on fear, it's built on respect, on accountability. It's what happens when you step into a courtroom and the world finally sees you for what you are, a man who thought he was above the rules." She leaned back, crossing her arms, her posture relaxed but her presence unyielding. "And they won't forget," she added, her words a quiet promise. Blake's gaze dropped, his throat constricting as he fought the urge to argue, to claw back some shred of dignity, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, beneath the layers of pride and denial, he knew she was right. He'd thrived in a system that shielded men like him, a world that turned a blind eye to his mistakes, his cruelties, his abuses of power. But not this time. This time, he'd been exposed, laid bare for all to see, and there was no hiding from it. Kesha watched him for a long, unhurried moment, her eyes tracing the lines of defeat etched into his face. Then she stood, her chair scraping faintly against the floor. "Your story's over," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet finality. "Mine's just beginning." She turned and walked toward the door, her step steady, purposeful. As it clicked shut behind her, Blake felt the crushing weight of an ending he couldn't escape. The truth had been hovering over him since the day he'd locked those cuffs around her wrists, and now it had landed with a force that left him hollow. He wasn't coming back from this, not ever. Outside, Kesha stepped into the hallway, drawing a deep breath as the cool air brushed against her skin. The past few days, years pressed against her chest, a tangle of memories and battles she'd fought alone. The weight of being underestimated, dismissed, forced to claw her way through a world that didn't want to see her. It was all there, simmering beneath her calm exterior. But there was no weariness in it, no surrender, only clarity, sharp and unyielding. She'd always known the game was rigged, that the rules bent differently for people like her. She'd had to work harder, fight fiercer, just to claim a fraction of the respect others were handed freely. And today, she'd proven something undeniable, not just for herself, but for every soul who'd ever been silenced, every life diminished by the careless swing of power. She stepped outside, the crisp night air biting at her cheeks as the city pulsed around her, cars humming, lights flickering, life marching on. The cameras were still there, their lenses trained on her, the world still watching. She squared her shoulders, her chin lifting slightly as she met their gaze. Justice wasn't perfect, it was slow, messy, riddled with flaws, but sometimes, when the right people refused to bend, when the truth refused to stay buried, it broke through. She'd make sure they kept watching, kept listening, because this wasn't the end. It was the spark of something bigger, a fight that was only just igniting. Back in the room, Blake sat motionless, the silence swallowing him whole. His hands trembled faintly as he stared at the table, the cold steel a mirror to the emptiness inside him. He'd built his life on the belief that power was his to wield, that consequences were for others to bear. But Kesha had shown him the lie, and not a lesson carved in the wreckage of his own making. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't just a word. It was a force, patient and relentless. And when it came for you, it didn't compromise. For men like him, who'd abused their authority without a thought, it was a mirror that revealed the ugliness they'd ignored. And for those like Kesha, who'd endured and fought back, it was a blade sharp, steady, and unforgiving. The soft glow of dawn spilled through the curtains, painting the room in hues of gold and amber as Marcus Thompson stood before his dresser. His fingers, steady yet reverent, worked the knot of his tie with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting small rituals. The early morning sunlight danced across the surface of his old state police badge, a silver emblem that gleamed faintly atop the wooden dresser. For 15 years, that badge had been his companion, a silent witness to every triumph, every struggle, every moment of doubt. But today was no ordinary day. Today, at the age of 42, Marcus was stepping into something new, the gold star of the county sheriff, a symbol of authority he'd never dared to dream of as a child. His reflection in the mirror told a story of its own. Deep-set eyes, etched with the weight of experience, stared back at him. He could still hear the echoes of his younger self, a boy darting through the overgrown backyard of his mother's modest home on the east side of town. Back then, the neighborhood kids would gather in the fading light of summer evenings, playing cops and robbers with sticks for guns and wild imaginations for fuel. Most of them clamored to be the robber-scunning outlaws who outsmarted the system, who saw the cops as the villains in their tales, but not Marcus. Even as a child, he'd felt a pull toward the other side, toward the idea of being the one who restored order, who protected the helpless, who made things right when the world tilted off balance. It wasn't just a game to him, it was a calling. That calling had been nurtured by his mother, Sarah Thompson, a woman whose strength seemed to defy the exhaustion of raising a son alone. She'd worked 2 jobs days at the textile factory, nights scrubbing floors at the hospital, her hands calloused, but her spirit unyielding, over bowls of steaming soup at their chipped kitchen table. She'd look at him with eyes that held both weariness and fire. "Baby," she'd say, her voice soft but firm, "you can be anything you set your mind to, but you've got to work twice as hard as everyone else to get there." Those words weren't just advice, they were a lifeline. They clung to him through every Molestinow school, where he graduated at the top of his class despite the whispers of teachers who doubted him. College, where he earned his criminal justice degree while pulling night shifts as a security guard. The hum of fluorescent lights his only company. And the police academy, where he pushed his body and mind to their limits, determined to prove he belonged. 15 years ago, when Marcus first pinned that silver badge to his chest as a state police officer, the road ahead had been anything but smooth. He was one of only 3 black officers in his unit, a fact that hung over him like a shadow. There were sit-along glances in the locker room, muttered comments he wasn't meant to hear, and sometimes outright hostility from colleagues who saw his presence as a threat. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a quiet ache he carried, but never spoke of. Yet Marcus refused to let it break him. Each doubt, each slight, became fuel. He enrolled in night classes, earning a master's degree in criminal justice administration while juggling daytime patrols. On the streets, he built a name for himself not through force, but through patience. He was the officer who could calm a volatile standoff with a steady voice, who memorized the names of shopkeepers and kids on his beat, who treated every person he encountered, whether a trembling victim or a defiant suspect, with a dignity that disarmed them. Over time, the whispers in the precinct shifted. Officers who once questioned him began seeking his counsel. Rookies trailed him like eager shadows, hungry for the wisdom he'd earned. Even those who'd sneered at him in the early days came to rely on his unshakable judgment. Year after year, his personnel file grew thick with commendation alerts from grateful citizens, notes from superiors praising his cool-headed leadership. So when the county sheriff position opened up, it wasn't ambition that first stirred in Marcus's heart, but hesitation. No black person had ever held the role in the county's long, storied history. The thought of applying felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind howling below. But Sarah, now silver-haired yet as fierce as ever, wouldn't let him falter. Over Sunday dinner, the clink of forks against plates punctuating her words, she leaned across the table. "Those barriers won't break themselves, Marcus," she said, her gaze locking with his. "Someone's got to be the first. Why not you?" Her faith in him was a force of nature, and it propelled him forward. The selection process was a grueling gauntlet. There were endless interviews, each question probing deeper into his resolve. Background checks that felt like an excavation of his life. Meetings with county officials who scrutinized him with polite skepticism. And presentations where he poured out his vision for the department. He spoke passionately about community policing, about forging trust between the badge and the people it served, about ensuring the department mirrored the diverse faces of the county. He laid out meticulous plans for training reforms, outreach programs, and accountability measures, his voice steady even as his palms grew damp. When the call finally came, Marcus was kneeling in his garden, the rich scent of earth and roses filling the air. He'd planted those flourishous mother's favorite years ago, a quiet tribute to her sacrifices. The county commissioner's voice crackled through the phone, formal yet warm. "Mr. Thompson, we'd be honored if you'd accept the position of county sheriff." Marcus paused, the pruning shears still in his hand, as the weight of the moment settled over him. That evening, as he shared the news over dinner, Sarah's eyes shimmered with tear pride mingling with worry. She reached for his hand, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers. "Baby, you're stepping into something bigger than you've ever faced," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Leadership's a different beast. It'll test you in ways you can't imagine." Marcus felt the truth of her words sink into his bones. He knew she was right, always was. That's why, in a quiet conversation with the county commissioner, he made an unconventional request: delay the public announcement of his appointment for 2 weeks. He wanted time to study the department from the inside out, to walk among his officers and the community as a shadow, unseen and unknown. Before taking the reins, the commissioner, though visibly perplexed, agreed. The paperwork was finalized discreetly, and Marcus received his new sheriff's credentials, a gold star, and an ID card without ceremony. Only a handful of top officials knew the truth. Now, as he finished knotting his tie, Marcus glanced at his reflection one last time. He didn't reach for the gold star or any marker of his new rank. Instead, he dressed in plain cloth as a simple blue polo and Kakishi's credentials tucked into his wallet, his personal firearm holstered discreetly at his side. For the next 2 weeks, he'd be a civilian in appearance, observing his department's heartbeat from the ground up. As he stepped out the door, his mother's voice lingered in his mind. "Sometimes the best way to lead is to first understand what needs fixing." She was right, as always, but neither of them could have foreseen how quickly that understanding would come, or the storm it would unleash. The summer sun blazed overhead, a molten disk suspended in a sky so blue it seemed to mock the heat below. Marcus guided his black Honda Civic through the winding streets of Oak Ridge, one of the county's wealthiest enclaves. The dashboard thermometer blinked 95 degrees, the air conditioning straining to keep the sweat from beading on his brow. It was just past 2 p.m., and the neighborhood unfolded around him like a postcard, sprawling homes with manicured lawns, rose bushes pruned to perfection, and driveways lined with gleaming SUVs. Oak Ridge was predominantly white, a fact that hung unspoken in the air as Marcus drove slowly down Maple Street. He felt the weight of eyes on him. An elderly woman paused mid-stride, her watering can dripping onto the pavement. A man walking his dog tilted his head, curiosity sharpening his gaze. Marcus had anticipated this. It was why he'd chosen to begin his observations here, in a place where his presence alone might stir unease. He wore no uniform, no badge, just the polo shirt and khakis that blended into the everyday. His sheriff's credentials rested in his wallet, nestled against his driver's license, while his firearm, a personal piece, licensed and secured, sat holstered beneath his shirt. To anyone watching, he was just another man driving through. Then came the sharp chirp of a siren behind him. Marcus's eyes flicked to the speedometer to 5 miles per hour, right on the limit. In the rearview mirror, a county patrol car loomed, its lights flashing red and blue. A familiar tension coiled in his shoulders, a sensation he'd known long before he ever wore a badge himself. He signaled right, easing the car to the curb, and placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, just as he'd taught countless citizens. In his community talks, through the side mirror, he watched 2 deputies approach, their boots scuffing the shimmering asphalt. The heat warped the air around them, creating ghostly ripples. Deputy Johnson led the way, a stocky white man in his early 30s. Blonde hair buzzed close to his scalp, his jaw set tight. Deputy Rodriguez, younger and leaner, trailed on the passenger side, his hand hovering near his holster with a casualness that belied its intent. Marcus knew them, not from this moment, but from the personnel files he'd pored over in preparation. Johnson carried 3 dismissed complaints of excessive force, a red flag buried in bureaucratic shrugs. Rodriguez, with only 2 years on the force, was still green, his record clean but untested. License and registration, Johnson barked, skipping any pretense of courtesy. His voice carried a hard edge, one Marcus recognized instant lithe tone of an officer who'd already made up his mind. "Good afternoon, officer," Marcus replied, his tone calm and measured, hands still visible on the wheel. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Johnson's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. License and registration." Now, the vagueness of the excuse prickled at Marcus's instincts. He knew there'd been no such reports. This was a pretext, a fishing expedition. Rodriguez edged closer, his hand still near his weapon, his posture tense but unreadable. "I understand," Marcus said evenly. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket, okay?" The cicadas droned in the trees overhead, their song a pulsing backdrop to the thickening tension. Across the street, a jogger slowed to a walk, craning her neck to watch. The elderly woman with the watering can stood frozen, a puddle spreading at her feet. "Slowly," Johnson ordered, his hand now resting on his own holster, fingers twitching faintly. Marcus moved with deliberate care, his mind racing. Inside his wallet were two truths, his driver's license and his sheriff's credentials. He could end this now, reveal who he was, and watch their faces shift. But something held him back. This momentous, unscripted encounter was the raw pulse of his department laid bare. He needed to see it through. As his fingers brushed the leather of his wallet, the air seemed to tighten, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. He didn't know it yet, but this routine stop was about to spiral into something far bigger, a flashpoint that would ripple through the county, exposing cracks in the system he'd sworn to lead. It would test him, just as his mother had warned, and force him to confront the cost of power misused. In that blistering summer light, with the eyes of Oak Ridge upon him, Marcus Thompson stood on the cusp of a reckoning that would redefine justice, not just for him, but for everyone his badge would serve. On a sweltering afternoon, the air thick with humidity, Marcus Thompson sat behind the wheel of his car, the sun blazing through the open window and baking the interior. His fingers brushed against the worn leather of his wallet, intending to retrieve his ID as requested, when Deputy Johnson's voice sliced through the stillness like a jagged blade. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The command was sharp, edged with an abrupt shift in tone that made Marcus pause mid-motion, his hand hovering just above his pocket. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, not from fear, but from the relentless heat pressing against his skin. With 15 years of law enforcement experience etched into his bones, Marcus responded with measured calm. "Officer, I'm reaching for my ID, just as you asked." His voice was steady, a deliberate anchor in the rising tension. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed Deputy Rodriguez inching closer to the driver's side, his shadow stretching across Marcus's lap like a dark omen. The younger officer's face was a storm of emotions, nervousness, warring with a strained attempt at authority. It was a look Marcus recognized all too well, one he'd seen in rookie cops too many times, a volatile mix that often ignited trouble. Rodriguez's eyes darted between Marcus and his partner, his fingers twitching near his belt as if unsure whether to rest or act. Meanwhile, Deputy Johnson's posture stiffened, his hand settling firmly on the holster at his hip. "Sir, exit the vehicle," he barked, the words heavy with unspoken menace. No explanation followed, no hint of why this routine stop had escalated so quickly. Marcus's trained eye caught the subtle flick of Johnson's thumb as it released the safety strap on his holster, a small, silent signal that screamed danger to anyone who knew what to look for. Inside, Marcus felt a crossroads looming. As the incoming sheriff, he could end this charade with a single flash of his badge, but as a seasoned officer, he understood the weight of this moment. This was his chance to peel back the mask and see how his deputies treated civilians when they thought no one of consequence was watching. The thought gnawed at him, a quiet fury building beneath his calm exterior. "May I ask why I need to step out?" he said, his tone professional but firm, a thread of curiosity laced with challenge. "I haven't broken any traffic laws, and you haven't told me what I'm suspected of." Johnson's face twisted, his jaw tightening as if the question itself was an insult, a direct affront to the power he wielded. "Step out of the car now, or we'll remove you," he snapped, his voice rising, brittle with impatience. A murmur rippled through the suburban street as a small crowd began to form, drawn by the unfolding drama. An elderly man, his dog tugging at its leash, stood frozen at the corner, his weathered face creased with concern. Two teenagers on bikes lingered across the street, their phones raised like tiny shields, capturing every second. A woman in a crisp business suit paused mid-stride by her mailbox, her keys jingling faintly in her hand as she stared, transfixed. Marcus felt their eyes on him, a silent chorus of witnesses to this quiet injustice. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed open the car door, the heat slamming into him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the searing asphalt. At 6'3", he towered over both deputies, but he kept his stance soft, hands lifted slightly to chest level in a gesture of peace. "Officers, I want to cooperate fully," he said, locking eyes with each man in turn. "But I also have the right to know why I'm being pulled from my vehicle during a standard stop. Turn around and place your hands on the car," Rodriguez piped up, his voice cracking with a faint tremor that betrayed his greenness. Marcus's gaze flicked to him, noting the way the young deputy's shoulders hunched, as if the weight of his badge was too much to bear. "I have identification you should see," Marcus tried again, his mind racing to the sheriff's credentials nestled in his wallet. Credentials that could flip this encounter on its head. But before he could finish, Johnson surged forward, his patience evaporating. "You had your chance to show ID," he growled, seizing Marcus's wrist with a roughness that sent a jolt through him. The metallic click of handcuffs rang out, sharp and final, echoing down the tree-lined street. The cold steel bit into Marcus's wrists, a sensation he'd administered countless times, but never felt himself. The irony twisted in his gut, his first taste of life as sheriff, and here he was, shackled by his own men. The crowd swelled, their whispers growing into a low hum of unease. "Again in this neighborhood," a woman muttered to her husband, her voice thick with resignation. Phones glinted in the sunlight, recording the scene as Marcus caught his reflection in the car window, a tall black man in a quiet, affluent suburb, now cuffed and powerless in the eyes of these deputies. What they couldn't see, was the man who'd soon hold their careers in his hands, the one destined to uproot the very culture that birthed this moment. "Car's clear," Rodriguez called out after a cursory glance through the windows, his tone faltering. Then his eyes landed on the holster at Marcus's hip, and his voice spiked with panic. "Armed suspect," Johnson shouted, his grip tightening on Marcus's arm, the words slicing through the humid air and shifting the scene into something darker, more perilous. The cicadas droned on in the trees overhead, their relentless song a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding below, a soundtrack to what would soon prove to be a defining moment in the county's history. Minutes later, Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, hands bound behind him, the air inside thick and suffocating. The deputies had turned off the AC, and the afternoon sun transformed the vehicle into a metal oven. The dashboard thermometer creeping past 97°F. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his white polo shirt until it clung to his skin like a second layer. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale a struggle against the oppressive heat. From his years on the force, Marcus knew the risk sheet: exhaustion, heat stroke, death lurking in conditions like these. "Officers," he called through the closed window, his voice steady despite the strain. "The heat in here is dangerous." Neither deputy responded. Johnson rummaged through the glove compartment, tossing papers onto the passenger seat, while Rodriguez rifled through a gym bag in the back, his movements jerky and uncertain. Marcus's wallet lay abandoned on the front seat, its contentious driver's license, his sheriff's badge untouched, a ticking bomb of revelation waiting to detonate. Outside, the crowd thickened, neighbors spilling from their homes like moths to a flame. An older black couple stood on their porch, arms crossed, their faces etched with a weary familiarity that spoke of too many scenes like this one. A young woman in a sundress stepped forward, her phone still rolling, her voice cutting through the haze. "You can't leave him in there like that, it's too hot." Others joined her, their protests rising in a ragged chorus. Rodriguez glanced at them, his brow furrowing with unease, then turned to Johnson. "Maybe we should check his ID," he suggested, his words tentative, almost pleading. Johnson didn't flinch, yanking Marcus's gym clothes from the bag and letting them fall to the street. "First we finish the search," he said, his tone ironclad. "He's not going anywhere." Inside the car, Marcus fought to steady his breathing, the heat pressing in like a living thing. The glass magnified the sun's rays, turning the space into a greenhouse of misery. His heart pounded, a wild rhythm against his ribs, and his vision blurred at the edges. 20 minutes had crawled by since they'd locked him in 20 minutes in a death trap that violated every protocol he'd ever enforced. As sheriff, he cataloged each misstep in his mind, the lack of justification, the excessive force, the reckless endangerment. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a glaring symptom of a system rotten at its core, a system he'd sworn to fix. Finally, Rodriguez's hand closed around the wallet, his fingers trembling as he flipped it open. The golden sheriff's badge gleamed in the sunlight, casting a blinding reflection across his face. His eyes widened, the color draining from his cheeks as he pulled out the ID, Marcus Thompson. "County Sheriff Johnson," he croaked, his voice breaking. "You need to see this now." Johnson stormed over, snatching the card from his partner's shaking hands. The badge glinted again, a beacon of truth in the haze. Marcus watched through a fog of heat and exhaustion as realization crashed over them, their faces twisting in shock and dread. His head swam, dark spots dancing before his eyes, but he clung to consciousness, knowing this moment was bigger than him. It was a reckoning for the deputies, for the department, for justice itself. As they fumbled with their keys, rushing to unlock the door, Marcus's thoughts sharpened. Power unchecked bred moments like this moments where authority became a weapon, where innocence was a liability. But consequences were coming. He'd make sure of it. The door swung open, and the rush of air hit him like a lifeline. He stepped out, unsteady but unbroken. The weight of his badge now a promise. Change was no longer a hope, it was a certainty. The air between Deputy Johnson and Deputy Rodriguez buzzed with a tension so thick it seemed to taunt them, as though the world itself were sneering at the colossal blunder they'd just made. Johnson's fingers trembled as he flipped the laminated credentials over and over, his breath catching in his throat each time his eyes landed on the unmistakable truth. Etched across them, Marcus Thompson, Riverside County's newly appointed sheriff, stared back at him from the photo, the official seal glinting in the afternoon sun like a cruel wink. The authorization codes lined up perfectly, every detail screaming legitimacy. "This can't be right," Johnson muttered under his breath, his voice a shaky mix of disbelief and dread. He kept turning the card, as if sheer willpower might rewrite the nightmare unfolding before him. But no matter how many times he flipped it, the reality refused to budge. Meanwhile, in the suffocating confines of the patrol car, Marcus Thompson slumped against the back seat, his body wilting under the relentless heat. The temperature inside had soared to a merciless high, the kind that turned the air into a thick, oppressive blanket. Sweat poured from him, soaking his polo shirt until it clung to his skin like a second sodden layer. His head lolled slightly, consciousness slipping in and out as the edges of his vision blurred. Years of law enforcement training whispered warnings through his foggy mind. Severe heat exhaustion, teetering dangerously close to heat stroke. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths, and his tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of his mouth. He tried to focus, to steady himself, but the car was a furnace, and every passing second drained a little more of his strength. Outside, the scene had spiraled into chaos. A crowd of onlookers swelled around the patrol car, their numbers growing as word of the fiasco spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Phones were raised high, capturing every agonizing moment, each bead of sweat on Marcus's forehead, each faltering step of the deputy's unraveling composure. Among them stood a young woman, her brow furrowed with concern as she'd been the first to speak up, her voice cutting through the murmurs earlier. Now, she clutched her phone to her ear, her words tumbling out in a rush as she dialed 911. "There's a man trapped in a hot car, please, hurry." Her eyes darted between the vehicle and the deputies, a mix of disbelief and outrage flickering across her face. Get him out now," Rodriguez's voice cracked, raw with panic. As he fumbled with the keys, his hands shook so violently that the metal jangled like a discordant chime, his usual steady demeanor crumbling under the weight of their mistake. Beside him, Johnson stood rooted to the spot, the sheriff's credentials still clutched in his grip. He stared at them as if they were a venomous creature coiled to strike, his mind racing to catch up with the horror sinking into his bones. They'd locked their new boss, the man they were meant to serve under, in a sweltering patrol car. During an illegal search, the sheer absurdity of it twisted his stomach into knots. But the evidence in his hands left no room for denial. When Rodriguez finally managed to wrench the door open, a wave of heat blasted outward, so intense it felt like standing too close to an open oven. Marcus slumped sideways, his body limp and barely clinging to consciousness. His skin burned to the touch, flushed an alarming red, and his breaths came in quick, ragged gasps. The crowd gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that underscored the gravity of the moment. A woman pushed forward a nurse who lived just down the street, her instincts kicking in as she dropped her grocery bags and rushed to his side. "He needs medical attention now," she snapped, her fingers pressing against Marcus's wrist to check his pulse. Her eyes widened as she felt the frantic hammering of his heart. "His heart rate's through the roof. This is dangerous." She whirled on the deputies, her voice sharp with accusation. "How long was he in there?" Rodriguez glanced at his watch, then quickly averted his eyes, shame etching deep lines into his young face. 20, maybe 25 minutes, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air, a confession that seemed to sap the last of his resolve. Johnson, meanwhile, jolted out of his stupor, fumbling for his radio as the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Ambulance lights flashed on the horizon, joined by the strobing blue and red of additional police units summoned. By the flurry of citizen calls, his voice trembled as he spoke into the receiver, trying to string together a report that danced around the truth, without admitting the full extent of their failure. "We've got a situation new, medical emergency requesting immediate assistance," he stammered, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Paramedics burst onto the scene, their movements swift and practiced as they swarmed around Marcus. The nurse had grabbed a portable fan from her bag, and its feeble breeze stirred the air around him as someone thrust a bottle of cold water into his hands. Slowly, his senses sharpened, the fog in his mind lifting as the coolness seeped into his parched throat. Even in his weakened state, Marcus exuded a quiet authority, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the deputies' spiraling panic. "Deputies," he rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. "We'll discuss this incident in detail once I've received medical clearance." The simplicity of his words carried the weight of a gavel, and both Johnson and Rodriguez straightened instinctively, their faces paling further despite the sweat still dripping from their brows. The crowd had fallen silent, their phones still recording as the paramedics worked. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, carried on the breeze of texts and calls already weaving the tale through the county. 2 deputies had locked their incoming sheriff in a scorching car, too reckless to check his ID before turning a routine stop into a near-fatal debacle. Senior officers arrived, their expressions shifting from confusion to grim realization as they pieced together the story. The credentials passed from hand to hand, each inspection confirming the unthinkable. This was their new sheriff, a man not yet announced to the public, now a victim of the very misconduct he'd been hired to root out. As paramedics eased Marcus onto a stretcher, his gaze caught on Johnson and Rodriguez, still hovering near their patrol car. They looked diminished, their earlier swagger replaced by a hollow awareness of the disaster they'd nearly caused. The sun dipped lower, its harsh glare softening, but the tension in the air remained electric. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The repercussions would echo through the department, a stark lesson in justice and the perils of unchecked power. Inside the ambulance, Marcus's mind churned despite his body's protests. He sipped the water, letting the cold steady him, already plotting how to transform this fiasco into a catalyst for change. The question wasn't whether there'd be consequence, there would be what shape they'd take. That choice rested solely with him, the man they'd left to bake in their car. Back by the patrol vehicle, Johnson yanked Rodriguez aside, their boots crunching on the gravel as they ducked out of the crowd's earshot. Their faces gleamed with sweat, but the dampness wasn't just from the heat anymore, it was fear. Cold and clammy, seeping into their bones. "We need to get our story straight," Johnson hissed, raking his hands through his short blonde hair for what felt like the dozenth time. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by a wild-eyed desperation. "This is bad, man, really bad." His voice quivered, teetering on the edge of hysteria. Rodriguez stared at his hands, still trembling from the moment he'd found the sheriff's ID. "Story straight," he echoed, his tone brittle and incredulous. "Johnson, we locked our new boss in a hot car. We almost killed him." His dark eyes glistened with unshed tears, the weight of their actions crashing over him like a tidal wave. He could see it all slipping away: his career, his pride, his future buried under the rubble of this single, catastrophic mistake. More senior officers rolled up, their presence amplifying the deputy's dread. Captain Rivera, a grizzled veteran with 25 years under his belt, stepped out of his SUV, his jaw tight as he reviewed their body camera footage. His weathered face darkened with every unnecessary escalation. The ignored pleas to verify ID, the reckless choice to abandon a man in a deadly heat trap. The crowd hadn't thinned. If anything, it had ballooned. A sea of faces buzzing with outrage and disbelief. Phones pinged with notifications. Videos spreading like wildfire across social media. Two deputies had racially profiled their own sheriff and nearly cooked him alive. "Listen to me." Johnson grabbed Rodriguez's arm, his grip bruising. "We followed procedure. There were reports of suspicious activity. I was uncooperative." "There weren't any reports," Rodriguez snapped, jerking his arm free. "You know that. I know that. And all these videos prove he was cooperative from the start." He gestured wildly at the crowd, at the damning evidence in their hands. "We can't lie our way out of this." Captain Rivera's shadow loomed as he approached, his voice a low growl. "Both of you in my car." Now, it wasn't a suggestion. They shuffled toward his vehicle, snippets of the crowd's chatter trailing behind them. They should be fired. Could have killed him. Typical profiling. Inside Rivera's SUV, the air conditioning blasted, a cruel irony after what they'd subjected Marcus to. The captain sat in silence, letting the tension coil tighter, his presence suffocating. 30 minutes, Rivera finally said, his words deliberate and heavy. "That's how long it'll take for every news outlet in the county to catch this. An hour. It's state news. By tonight, national." He turned to face them, his gaze piercing. "So think very carefully about what you do next." Johnson opened his mouth, but Rivera silenced him with a raised hand. "I've seen the body cam. I've seen the civilian footage. There's no spinning this. You let that sink in. Honesty complete. Brutal honesty is your only play here." Rodriguez nodded, defeated. But Johnson clung to a shred of defiance. "Sir, if we could just explain." "Your perspective," Rivera's voice sliced through like a blade. "Your perspective was caught on camera, deputy. Every second from profiling him to realizing you locked your new boss in a death trap." The silence that followed was a void, swallowing their excuses whole. Outside, Marcus sat in the ambulance's open bay, waving off the paramedics' insistence on a hospital trip. He sipped water, his body still shaky but his mind razor-sharp. "I appreciate your concern," he told the lead paramedic, his tone polite but firm. "But I need to handle this." Through the window, Rodriguez watched him, awe and guilt warring in his chest. "He's staying," he murmured. "Even after what we did, he's staying to deal with it himself." Johnson slumped lower, his fight draining away. They both turned as Marcus stood, smoothing his drenched shirt with a dignity that belied his ordeal. He strode toward Rivera's car, his steps measured, his face a mask of calm resolve. "He's coming to talk to us," Rodriguez whispered, fear lacing his words. "No," Rivera corrected, a faint note of respect in his tone. "Your new sheriff is coming to show you what real leadership looks like." Marcus Thompson paused beside the ambulance, his mind already mapping the path ahead. This wasn't just a mistake to punish, it was a reckoning, a chance to forge justice from the ashes of arrogance, and he intended to see it through. In the sweltering heat of that unforgettable afternoon, Marcus Thompson stood amidst the chaos, his heart pounding not with rage but with a quiet, resolute determination. The memory of the past lingered like a bitter taste, handcuffs biting into his wrists, the stifling air of the patrol car pressing against his chest, and the stunned murmurs of the crowd echoing in his ears. Yet, as he pulled his phone from his pocket, its sleek surface still warm from the glove compartment of his car, he felt a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. something that demanded justice not through vengeance, but through clarity and accountability. Opening the camera app, he began to move toward the patrol car where he'd been confined. His steps deliberate, almost reverent, as though approaching a sacred site of reckoning. The crowd around him parted like a sea, their phones still raised, capturing every flicker of his expression, every measured stride. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his focus was unshakable. He leaned into the open door of the patrol car, the lingering heat wafting out like a warning, and aimed his lens at the dashboard thermometer. The digital display glared back at him, 108, a number that told a story of negligence louder than any shout could. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what this evidence meant. This wasn't just a malfunctioning vehicle. It was a symbol of a system that had grown careless with the lives it was meant to protect. "Officer Chen," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the gathered onlookers. It was steady, professional, the tone of a man who had processed countless crime scenes, though this one carried a personal sting. Officer Chen, a seasoned figure with graying temples and a perpetually furrowed brow, turned sharply at the sound of his name. He'd arrived moments earlier, his presence a quiet anchor amid the storm of flashing lights and restless voices. "Please take official temperature readings of the patrol car's interior and document them," Marcus instructed, his words firm yet devoid of malice. Chen nodded, his face tightening as he retrieved a thermal sensor from his vehicle, its sleek design gleaming faintly in the sunlight. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many tense situations, yet his hands hesitated for a fraction of a second as he approached the car, as if sensing the gravity of what he was about to confirm. The sensor beeped softly, its readings climbing higher with each passing moment. Chen's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and grim, carrying the weight of unwelcome truth. "Interior temperature peaked at 108 F, sir, well above the department's safety protocols." His eyes flickered to Marcus, searching for a reaction, but Marcus only nodded, his fingers tapping the numbers into his phone with the precision of a surgeon. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, their phones still rolling. As Marcus turned toward his own vehicle, the sight that greeted him twisted something deep in his gut. Gym clothes strewn across the asphalt, like discarded relics, papers fluttering from the open door, caught in the faint breeze. The deputy's search had left his car in disarray, a silent testament to the chaos of the encounter. He raised his phone again, documenting every detail: crumpled socks, the scattered forms, the smudged fingerprints on the window, as if each image were a brick in the case he was building. Turning to the onlookers, Marcus held up a business card, its edges slightly worn from his wallet. "Would anyone who recorded videos of the incident please send them to this email address?" His voice carried a quiet authority, tempered by gratitude. Several people stepped forward without hesitation. A young woman with wide, determined eyes who'd dialed 911, her hands still trembling from adrenaline. An older man with a weathered face, his phone clutched tightly as if it were a lifeline. Marcus met each of them with a handshake, his voice softening as he thanked them by name, scribbling their contact details into his phone with care. Their willingness to help wasn't just evidence. It was a fragile thread of trust he intended to nurture. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Deputies Johnson and Rodriguez, huddled in Captain Rivera's patrol car. Their faces were a study in contrasts: Johnson's pale and pinched with dread, Rodriguez's dark eyes darting nervously, as though expecting the ground to open beneath them. They'd braced themselves for a storm of fury, for shouted accusations and immediate retribution. Instead, they watched in stunned silence as Marcus moved with the methodical grace of a seasoned investigado. His every action a deliberate step toward truth rather than punishment. Their shoulders stiffened as he approached, but Marcus's expression remained unreadable, his focus unshaken by the emotions swirling beneath the surface. He opened the car door, the faint creak of hinges cutting through the tension. "Deputies," he said, his voice level, almost gentle, though it carried an undeniable weight. "I need your badge numbers, your body camera footage, and your incident reports. Then I need you both to head to the station and write detailed statements about everything that happened here today." He paused, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "Johnson, whose mouth twitched as if to protest, and Rodriguez, whose gaze dropped to his boots. "I expect complete honesty," Marcus continued, his tone sharpening just enough to underscore his meaning. "Not what you think I want to hear, but exactly what happened and why." Johnson opened his mouth, a half-formed excuse teetering on his lips, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it for your statement, Deputy, right now. I just need your cooperation in documenting this properly." As the deputies fumbled to comply, their movements jerky with unease, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly. Notifications poured in, videos of the incident already rippling across social media, shared and reshared by unseen hands. In the distance, the rumble of news vans grew louder, their reporters spilling out with microphones and eager questions. But Marcus paid them no mind. Fame wasn't his goal. Headlines wouldn't fix what was broken. He returned to his task, weaving through the crowd to speak with witness nurse who'd rushed to his side. Her hands steadied despite the fear in her eyes, the elderly couple who'd watched from their porch, their faces creased with concern and quiet outrage. He typed their statements into his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he captured every word, every nuance of their shaken voices. Captain Rivera approached, his boots scuffing the pavement, his broad frame casting a shadow over Marcus. "Sir," he said, his voice gruff but respectful, "Internal Affairs is on their way. They want to take over the investigation." Marcus looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, though his composure never wavered. "They're welcome to conduct their investigation, Captain," he replied, gesturing to the scene around them, flashing lights, the murmuring crowd, the patrol car still radiating heat. "But I'm conducting my own as well. This isn't just about 2 officers or 1 incident. It's about systemic issues that need to be addressed." His words hung in the air, heavy with purpose, a quiet vow to unearth the rot that had festered too long. Officer Chen called out again, his thermal sensor still in hand. "The temperature readings have been logged and witnessed, sir. Do you need anything else?" Marcus straightened, surveying the scene one last time. Scattered papers, the watchful crowd, the deputies' averted gazes. "Yes," he said softly, almost to himself. "I need everyone to understand that this isn't the end of something. It's the beginning." A week later, Marcus sat behind the wide oak desk in the sheriff's office, the morning sun spilling through the window and glinting off the golden badge pinned to his chest. It was the same badge he'd carried in his wallet during that fateful traffic stop, now resting where it belonged. The past 7 days had been a whirlwind. National media outlets splashing his story across screens, and papers, new black sheriff detained by his own deputies. The coverage had been relentless, but Marcus had turned away every interview request, his focus locked on the changes he was crafting. He traced his fingers over the final revisions to the department's new training protocols, each word a brick in the foundation of something better. Across from him, Deputies Johnson and Rodriguez sat stiffly in their chairs, their uniforms crisp but their expressions uneasy. Johnson, with his weary frame and restless hands, shifted as though the seat burned him. Rodriguez, broader and quieter, kept his eyes fixed on the desk, his jaw tight with unspoken questions. They'd expected to be fired, their careers snuffed out in a blaze of disgrace. Instead, Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Here's what's going to happen," he began, his gaze steady. "You're both going to help me teach the new anti-bias training program. You'll share your perspective from that day, what you were thinking, what assumptions you made, and what you learned from it." Johnson's brow furrowed, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Sir, I don't understand. Why aren't we being terminated?" It was the question that had gnawed at them both, a quiet terror that had shadowed their every step since the incident. Marcus leaned back, his hands resting on the desk, his eyes searching theirs. "Because firing you would be easy," he said, his tone softening but never losing its edge. "It'd make headlines for a day, maybe a week, but it wouldn't solve the real problem." He stood, crossing to the window where the town stretched out below, bathed in golden light. "We need to change the culture, not just punish individuals." The new training program was a tapestry of reform. Every officer would spend hours in community engagement, walking the streets they patrolled, listening to the voices they served. The body camera footage from that blistering afternoon would be dissected in training sessions, a raw lesson in how bias could turn a routine stop into a near tragedy. Rodriguez raised a tentative hand, his voice hesitant. "But sir, won't showing that footage, won't it humiliate us?" Marcus turned, his expression softening but firm. "This isn't about humiliation," he said. "It's about learning. Every officer will sit in a hot car safely monitored. Of course I'll feel what I felt. To understand why we never leave anyone in a patrol car with the air conditioning off." The changes rippled outward. Traffic stop protocols were rewritten, identification checks now mandatory before any search. Community feedback sessions were scheduled, open forums where citizens could speak their truths without fear. Johnson and Rodriguez faced 2 weeks of suspension without pay, but their real penance lay in the work ahead. Johnson was assigned to mentor youth in Oak Ridge, the same neighborhood he'd once eyed with suspicion, his sneakers now pounding the pavement alongside kids who'd watched him falter. Rodriguez, fluent in Spanish, joined outreach programs with immigrant families, his voice a bridge where walls once stood. "The hardest part," Marcus added, his gaze piercing, "will be earning back the community's trust. You'll walk beats in Oak Ridge, meet the people who saw you detain me, and show them who you can become." The transformation wasn't seamless. Some officers bristled, clinging to old ways like lifelines, their grumbles echoing through the precinct. But Marcus's approach, firm yet fair, rooted in education rather than retribution, began to bear fruit. Complaints dwindled, replaced by tentative handshakes and cautious smiles. Other departments called, curious about the training that was turning heads. 6 months later, Marcus sat in his office with his mother, Sarah, the scent of coffee curling between them. Her eyes shimmered with pride as she spoke. "You turned a terrible situation into something positive, just like you always do." Marcus smiled, his mind drifting to Johnson coaching a basketball game with local teens, to Rodriguez teaching a Spanish language safety class. The department was shifting, slowly but surely, into the vision he'd always held. "Sometimes," he said, echoing his own words from that sweltering day, "the best way to lead is to understand what needs to be changed." He lifted a community feedback report, its pages brimming with praise for the department's new heart. On his desk, a framed photograph of the dashboard thermometer, 108 degrees Fahrenheit, stood as a sentinel, a reminder of why they pressed on. Beneath it, he'd scrawled a simple truth: every crisis is an opportunity, every mistake a chance to learn, every day a new beginning. The sun streamed through the window, bathing a department reborn at perfect, but striving. More just, all because one man had chosen to forge light from shadow, to wield justice not as a weapon, but as a tool for healing.